The sound of my father's fist hitting the oak table still echoes in my mind. The silverware jumped wine sloshed against glass, and my mother's hand froze mid-motion with the serving spoon. The smell of baked meatloaf and garlic mashed potatoes filled the room, my favorite meal suddenly hard to swallow. Across the table, my sister Olivia wore that half smile she used whenever she knew something was about to go her way. Dad's voice followed low and sharp. "Either agree to give up your room," he said, "or get out of this house." No one breathed. Not even the old grandfather clock in the hallway dared to tick. I looked at the faces I'd grown up studying, my father's lined with authority, my mother's carefully neutral, and Olivia's lit with quiet triumph. Somewhere beneath the table, my hands trembled against my napkin, but my face didn't show it. I smiled instead, small and deliberate, the kind of smile you give when a truth finally reveals itself. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been made to feel small inside your own family, hit that like button and share this story with someone who'll understand. Now, to understand how that dinner changed everything you need to know where it all began. I was 32, still living in my parents' colonial home on a quiet street outside Boston, the same house where I'd grown up. It wasn't out of dependence. It was practicality. When Dad was laid off 6 years earlier, I'd started contributing to the household, first the mortgage, then groceries, then the electric bill. When his work returned, my payments didn't stop. I told myself it was temporary. It became permanent. 40% of the household expenses came from my paycheck. They never asked. I volunteered. I told myself that's what good daughters do. Olivia, 5 years younger, told herself that rules never applied to her. She called it finding herself drifting between jobs that ended faster than they began, retail marketing schemes, unfinished college courses. When she moved back home after her latest breakup, her room became a wreck of glitter, half-painted canvases, and unpaid bills. Still, my parents called her sensitive, as if chaos were a condition that needed protection. "Be patient with her," Mom would say, stacking dishes I'd washed. "She's trying what I used to wonder. Trying my patience, perhaps." Grandma Eleanor, the only one who ever called it like she saw it, warned my mother years ago. That child needs boundaries, not coddling. But my mother only smiled, that teacher smile meant to end a conversation. "You don't understand how sensitive Olivia is, Mom." And that was that. While my sister wandered, I built. Straight A student scholarship graduate financial analyst at Meridian Investments. My promotions came quietly. I never boasted. When I told my parents about my latest raise, Mom nodded once and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning the conversation to Olivia's new idea, something about handmade jewelry online. That night, I remember sitting on my bed realizing no one had ever once said, "We're proud of you, Hilda." But I stayed. The house was home after all. My room, large windows facing east, a small private bath I'd renovated myself, had become my sanctuary. Every inch of it carried my hand. The bookshelves, I built the tile. I laid the paint I chose. That space was proof of who I was, organized, deliberate, quiet. When Olivia returned home after her breakup, things shifted. She began borrowing my car for errands, then leaving it empty on gas. She borrowed money, 20 here, 50 there, with vague promises to repay. She slept until noon, left trails of clothes from hall to kitchen, and somehow my parents laughed it off. "She's going through a hard time," Dad would say. "Can't you just help your sister out?" Help was a one-way street in our family. I drove it daily, unpaid and unthanked. That Sunday morning began like any other. A text from Mom: "Family dinner tonight. Important meeting." The words unsettled me. She'd never called dinner a meeting. When I came home from my morning run, I caught whispers in the kitchen, Mom's hushed tone, Dad's deep murmur, Olivia's bright laugh. They went silent when I walked in. Olivia smiled sweetly. "Morning, sis." It was the kind of smile that told me a decision had already been made. All day, odd gestures stacked up like clues. Dad fixed the hinge on my bathroom door, something he'd ignored for months. Mom baked my favorite pie. Olivia kept slipping into my room with a measuring tape claiming she was planning a project. By the time dinner was served, I felt the pressure in the air thick and electric. Something was coming. We sat at the table set with the good china usually reserved for Thanksgiving. Dad poured wine even for me, which he rarely did. Mom kept refilling my plate, her voice too bright, too casual. "How's work going, honey?" "Fine," I said, cautious. She nodded, eyes darting toward Dad. Then she cleared her throat. "Hilda," she began, "your sister's been working hard to start her online jewelry business. She needs a proper space for inventory and photos. We thought," she hesitated, "it might make sense for you two to switch rooms." I stared at her. "Switch rooms?" Olivia leaned in. "Mine's too small for my work. You hardly spend time at home anyway." Mom rushed to soften it. "You could take the guest room in the basement. It's cozy." The guest room was half the size of mine, concrete floors, one window, always cold, no matter the season. I'd spent years turning my room into a home within a home. They wanted to trade it like a piece of furniture. "You want me in the basement so Olivia can have my room?" I asked. Dad's expression hardened. "It's not a want, it's what's happening. Olivia needs the space more. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes." Olivia smirked. I mentioned the renovations I'd paid for the shelving, the bathroom fixtures. Mom waved it off. "We'll help you move your things." Dad's hand struck the table, then rattling the glasses. "Enough discussion. Either agree to the move or get out of this house." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the veins on his wrist pulse, the red flush on his neck, the slight tremble of Mom's shoulders. For years, that voice had been law in our home. For years, I'd obeyed. But something shifted in that stillness. It wasn't rebellion, it was clarity, cold and steady. All the times I'd swallowed unfairness, all the years I'd paid bills and kept peace stacked up behind my ribs like bricks. And suddenly, I felt nothing but calm. "I understand," I said quietly. 3 words, no emotion. Dad blinked, thrown off balance. Mom exhaled, mistaking surrender for agreement. Olivia looked almost disappointed that I hadn't fought. "Well," Mom said carefully, "we can start moving things this weekend. That gives me a few days to prepare," I replied, nodding. Inside, the decision had already formed. I wouldn't take the basement, and I wouldn't leave without a plan. Dinner ended with awkward small talk about curtains and furniture placement. I smiled when appropriate, tasted the pie that suddenly felt too sweet, and excused myself early. As I climbed the stairs to my room, my real room, I heard Olivia downstairs chatting about color palettes and shelving ideas. Her laughter trailed behind me, bright and hollow. When I closed my door, I leaned against it, breathing slow, feeling the solid wood against my back. My sanctuary, my investment, my life reduced to a negotiation over space. I looked around the shelves I'd built, the soft morning light. I loved the quiet order I had created and understood exactly what that dinner meant. It wasn't about a room. It was about value, who mattered and who didn't. I walked to my window, the streetlights flickering through the trees, and whispered into the stillness, "This is the last time." Downstairs, laughter carried faintly up through the vents, my family's easy comfort returning, believing the conversation was over. They didn't know it yet, but everything had just begun to change. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. Laughter drifted up from downstairs, muffled through the vents, but it sounded distant, like voices from another world. I sat on my bed, staring at the shelves I'd built with my own hands, tracing the smooth wood edges where I'd once measured each cut so carefully. Everything in that room was a piece of me, and now it had become a target. The silence pressed close, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the faint creak of the floorboards. I wanted to scream to demand fairness, but years of conditioning held me still. Instead, I walked into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and sank to the floor as the steam filled the room. Hot water drowned the sound of my breathing, and for the first time in years, I let the tears fall freely. I wasn't crying about a bedroom. I was crying about years of being the one who held the family together while my sister floated through life untouched by consequence. I cried for the countless times I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace for every dinner where my accomplishments were dismissed, for every favor asked without gratitude. The tiled floor beneath me was cold, but the tears came hot, raw, and unfiltered. When the water began to cool, I rose slowly and wiped the mirror clear with my hand. My reflection looked calm again, but my eyes didn't lie. They carried something new. I whispered to the woman in the mirror, "This is the last time they make you feel small." After I changed into pajamas, I pulled out my leather-bound journal from the nightstand, the one Grandma Eleanor had given me on my 21st birthday. She'd written inside the cover, "Never let anyone else narrate your worth." I filled page after page that night, anger, hurt, disbelief. All of it spilled onto paper until the words steadied me. By the time I stopped writing, the clock read 1:47 a.m. My decision wasn't fully formed, but the spark was there. Something inside me whispered that I would not move to that basement, and I would not stay here, as if I had no choice. The next morning, I woke early, brewed coffee, and sat by the window with the mug cradled between my hands. The neighborhood was still half asleep, the sky washed in gray light. That quiet hour made everything clear. I needed to leave, but not in anger, not without a plan. I dialed a familiar number. The phone rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. "Hilda, is everything all right?" It was Grandma. I didn't try to hide the tremor in my voice. "They want me to move into the basement so Olivia can have my room." There was a pause long enough to let the meaning sink in. Then her voice came steady and firm. "Those fools. What are you going to do?" "I'm not taking the basement," I said, "but I won't storm out either. I think it's time I bought my own place." "Good girl," she replied. I could hear the smile in her voice. "You've spent too long giving. It's time you claim something that's yours." We talked for nearly an hour about loans, down payments, even neighborhoods. She offered to help, not financially, but with advice and a few contacts she still had in real estate. When I finally hung up, I felt lighter, almost clear-headed. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. My boss was understanding. She said to take whatever time I needed. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up my savings, and began running numbers. 5 years of disciplined saving had built a nest egg of $87,000. My investment account held another $43,000. My credit score pristine. For the first time, I realized I was more prepared for independence than I'd ever imagined. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with Sarah Collins, a friend from college who'd become a realtor. "How fast do you want to move?" she asked after hearing my situation. "As soon as humanly possible," I said. "Let's start today," she replied. "You'd be surprised what's out there if you know where to look." That afternoon, I met her at a small cafe near my office. Sarah looked at me with a mix of concern and admiration. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "But this is a big step, Hilda. Are you sure you're ready?" I stirred my coffee and watched the cream swirl into patterns. I've been ready for years. I just didn't know it. Over the next 3 days, we visited one property after another. Clean houses, cluttered houses, a few that smelled faintly of mildew. Some were beautiful, but out of reach. Others were affordable, but soulless. I told Sarah I wasn't just looking for walls and a roof. I wanted peace. Then, on the fourth afternoon, she pulled up to a house that made my heart stop. A 2-story colonial with chipped white paint and a for sale sign leaning slightly in the yard. It looked familiar, too familiar. When she parked, I looked through the windshield and froze. It was directly across the street from my parents' house. Coincidence, I asked. Maybe Sarah said, with a small smile. Or maybe the universe has a sense of humor. It just came on the market yesterday. Foreclosure. The bank wants it gone fast. I stepped out and walked up the cracked walkway. The porch creaked beneath my feet, and a loose shutter tapped lightly against the siding in the breeze. But the structure itself solid. Inside, sunlight spilled through wide front windows onto scuffed hardwood floors. The air smelled of dust and potential. In the living room, I stopped by the front window and looked out. Across the street, I could see the edge of my parents' driveway, my father's truck parked exactly where it always had been. A strange calm settled over me, a sense of quiet symmetry. "This is it," I said softly. Sarah raised her brows. "You sure?" "Completely." We made the offer that evening, $290,000, with a quick closing. I could cover the down payment in cash. Sarah handled the paperwork with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before. 2 days later, she called to say the bank had accepted. That night, I packed quietly. Not to move to the basement, but to leave entirely. I moved slowly, sorting books into boxes, folding clothes, labeling everything. When Mom asked from the hallway how my moving prep was going, I told her I was just organizing. It wasn't a lie. I was organizing my exit. Each night after work, I carried one box at a time to my car. Some went to a small storage unit I'd rented under my name. Others to my friend Laura's garage, who lived 2 towns over. Every item I packed felt like an act of reclamation, proof that I could exist outside their walls. Still, the secrecy gnawed at me. Years of being honest made deception feel like a betrayal of my own nature. I scheduled a session with my therapist, Dr. Landry, to talk it through. She listened quietly as I explained the plan, the house, the move, the need for silence. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "What you're doing isn't deception for its own sake. It's protection. You've been trying to set boundaries through honesty for years, and it hasn't worked. Sometimes, distance has to come first." Her words lifted the guilt off my chest. For the first time in a long while, I felt justified in protecting my peace. Over the following week, everything moved faster than I expected. The inspection went smoothly, the mortgage approved in record time. The closing date was set for 2 weeks later, the exact weekend my parents planned to help me move downstairs. The symmetry almost made me laugh. At night, I lay awake in my half-empty room, listening to the quiet. Every breath, every creak of the old house felt different now. I was no longer a resident. I was a guest, passing through, counting the days, until freedom. 3 nights before the closing, Olivia walked in without knocking, holding a measuring tape. She stretched it across my wall, mumbling about curtains and paint colors. "You'll have to move your bed soon," she said absently. "I'm thinking pale yellow for the walls." I watched her for a moment, the way she hummed to herself, utterly unaware of what was coming. There was a time when her thoughtlessness would have broken me. Now it only confirmed that leaving was the right choice. When she left, I closed the door and leaned against it the same way I had that first night after dinner. My room looked different now. Boxes stacked neatly, shelves, bare walls, showing faint outlines where pictures once hung. I turned off the light and sat in the quiet, the moonlight spilling through the curtains. In the silence, I felt something shift. The fear that had followed me since childhood began to dissolve, replaced by a calm that felt almost foreign. I realized this wasn't rebellion. It was healing. 2 days later, I signed the final papers. The keys were cold in my palm, heavier than I expected. Outside, the sky was bright with early spring sunlight. I walked through the empty rooms of my new home, touched the smooth walls, and breathed deeply. The air smelled of paint and freedom. That night, I stood by the window of my parents' house one last time. Across the street, my new porch light glowed softly through the branches. For the first time in years, I felt completely still inside. I wasn't angry anymore, just ready. When I turned out the light, I whispered to the dark, "You have no idea what's coming next." The house creaked in reply, familiar, but no longer mine. And that was exactly how it should be. That night, I barely slept. The house had fallen quiet, but my mind kept running through every word, every look from that dinner table. Somewhere downstairs, the dishwasher hummed. Upstairs, I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slow and steady, marking time until morning. When the first light broke through my window, I sat up. The anger from the night before had cooled into something heavier resolve. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the yard shimmer under dew. Birds hopped along the fence, oblivious to the storm brewing inside that house. I took a deep breath and dialed the one person who had never sugar-coated the truth. "Grandma?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted. She answered on the second ring, her tone sharp with concern. "What's happened, Hilda?" "They told me to move into the basement," I said, "so Olivia can have my room." There was a pause long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then softly but firmly she said, "Those fools." "What are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet, but I'm done letting them decide what I deserve." "Good," she said. "You've carried them long enough. It's time you carry yourself." Her certainty steadied me. We talked for almost an hour, not about revenge, but about direction. By the time I hung up, I'd made a decision I would leave, but not in anger, and not without a plan. I called in sick to work for the first time in years and spread my financial papers across the kitchen table. The numbers looked back at me like quiet proof of who I'd become. Steady income, strong savings, excellent credit. For the first time, I realized I could stand completely on my own. Before noon, I was on the phone with Sarah Collins, a college friend turned real estate agent. "You sound determined," she said when I told her what had happened. "Let's see what's out there. How fast do you want to move?" "As fast as possible." By that afternoon, we were walking through a string of small houses, some clean, some half collapsed, but none felt right. Until we turned onto a tree-lined street I knew too well. Sarah slowed the car, pointing toward a colonial with peeling paint and an uneven porch. "That one just hit the market," she said. "Foreclosure. The bank's looking for a quick sale." My chest tightened. It sat directly across from my parents' house. Inside, the air smelled of dust and disuse, but the bones were good. Sunlight poured through wide windows onto scuffed floors. Standing in what would be the living room, I looked out across the street and saw my father's truck in its usual spot. A strange calm filled me. "This is it," I whispered. Sarah studied my face. "You sure absolutely." That evening, we put in an offer $290,000 with 20% down. 2 days later, the bank accepted. The rest moved quickly. I told my parents nothing. Each night, I packed a little more books, clothes, things that were mine alone, and carried them quietly to my car. Some went to a small storage unit, the rest to my friend Laura's garage 2 towns over. When my mother asked how basement prep was going, I smiled and said I was organizing. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. Still, the secrecy gnawed at me. Years of honesty made this kind of silence feel like betrayal. I booked an emergency appointment with my therapist, Dr. Landry, to ask if I was losing myself in the process. She listened patiently, then said, What you're doing isn't deceit. It's protection. You've tried honesty for years, and it only kept you stuck. Sometimes, distance is the first real boundary. Her words unclenched something in me. The guilt eased, replaced by focus. Within a week, everything aligned as if it had been waiting. The inspection passed, the loan cleared, and the closing date landed exactly 2 weeks after that dinner, the same weekend my parents planned to help me move downstairs. I almost laughed when I saw the date. 3 nights before closing, Olivia came into my room with a measuring tape. "Just checking dimensions," she said cheerfully. "I'm thinking soft yellow walls and a jewelry desk by the window." I nodded, saying nothing. She didn't notice the boxes stacked by the closet or the empty shelves. She didn't see the quiet goodbye already written on the walls. The next morning, Sarah called with final paperwork. "Congratulations," she said. "It's yours." The keys felt heavier than I expected, cool metal pressing into my palm like proof. I stood in the empty house and listened to the echo of my own footsteps, the scent of old wood and sunlight drifting through open windows. For the first time, the air around me belonged entirely to me. That evening, I returned to my parents' house. Everything looked the same, the porch light buzzing, the curtains drawn, but it all felt smaller. I walked up the stairs past Olivia's laughter into my room one last time. The shelves were bare, the bed stripped, the walls pale where frames once hung. I sat on the edge of the mattress and traced the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. Downstairs, my family's voices carried through the vents, soft, familiar, untroubled. They thought the world was unchanged. They had no idea that by the end of the week, everything would shift. I turned off the light, opened the window to the cool night air, and whispered into the dark, "I'm done waiting for permission." The words felt final, solid, the kind of promise you only need to make once. When the last box left the back of the moving truck, the air around me felt different, lighter, almost clean. By noon, every piece of furniture, every book, every quiet part of my life had crossed the street into the house that now belonged to me. From my new living room window, I could see my parents' front porch. The curtains were drawn tight, as if the house itself didn't want to look at what had changed. At 3:30, my mother's car pulled into their driveway. She went inside carrying grocery bags, her steps unhurried, unaware. I watched her silhouette move from kitchen to hallway, then stop at the foot of the stairs. It didn't take long. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with her text. "Hilda, where are you? Where is your furniture?" I didn't answer. By the time my father's truck appeared, the sun had started to fall behind the oaks, casting long shadows across both lawns. I could see him pacing by the porch, phone pressed to his ear, the angle of his shoulders sharp with confusion. He hung up, tried again, then finally turned toward my house. Mom followed a few steps behind him, her hand fluttering near her chest, the way it always did when she didn't understand something. Olivia stood on their porch, arms crossed, that familiar smirk, trying to hide uncertainty. I stepped outside before they could knock. The scent of fresh paint still hung on the air from the porch railing I'd finished 2 nights earlier. My father stopped at the edge of my lawn, the look on his face caught somewhere between disbelief and anger. "What is this?" he demanded. "Whose house is this?" "Mine," I said quietly. "I bought it." Mom blinked, her voice thin. "How could you afford a house I've been saving for years?" I replied. "Working hard, contributing more than my share. You just never asked where it went." My father's jaw tightened. "So, this is your answer to a simple room change? You think you can just move out across the street?" I felt my pulse steady. It wasn't a request, Dad. It was an ultimatum. You said, agree or get out. I chose option 3. He stood there breathing hard. Behind him, Olivia shifted her weight, her confidence starting to crack. My mother's eyes filled, but she said nothing. I handed my father the house key that had hung on my ring since college. I won't be needing this anymore, I said. He took it without a word, closed his hand around it, and turned back toward their house. Mom lingered a few seconds longer, her voice breaking just above a whisper. I don't understand why you do this. Because you never asked what I needed, I said. You just decided what suited everyone else. When their door finally closed behind them, I went back inside. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I leaned against the door, letting the calm settle. It wasn't triumph I felt, just a strange, expansive peace. For the first time in years, I was in a space where no one could tell me to shrink. The first week passed in silence. My parents sent texts. I mostly ignored questions, accusations, small attempts to draw me back into familiar patterns. When I did reply, I kept it brief, no emotion, no explanations. Across the street, I could see curtains twitch, lights turn on and off at odd hours. I imagined their dinners quieter now, with one less person to take responsibility for the mood. By day 3, my father's messages turned sharp. If this is how you want it, fine. Don't come crawling back when your independence fails. Another followed hours later. Your mother is sick over this. Is that what you wanted? Each word was meant to sting, but instead, they landed dull and distant like echoes of a life I no longer lived. Mom's texts came softer, carefully chosen to sound loving, but threaded with guilt. Just letting you know I've been crying all day. We miss you. Then later, Olivia says she tried to defend you, but maybe you're happier now. They were attempts to reopen the same wound, but it didn't work this time. Olivia took to social media posting about toxic relatives and fake loyalty. Neighbors read between the lines faster than she expected. Within days, my phone buzzed with calls from extended family, an aunt, 2 cousins, even Uncle Patrick from Maine. They wanted to know the real story. I told them the truth, the ultimatum, the years of imbalance, the dinner that broke whatever was left of fairness. My aunt's voice trembled. Your parents always had a blind spot with Olivia, she said. We saw it, but we thought it wasn't our place. That quiet acknowledgement was worth more than any apology from my parents. By the 3rd week, the cracks across the street began to show. Without my 40% contribution, their budget couldn't stretch far. The lawns started to grow wild, the flower beds turned to weeds. I noticed the porch light stayed off at night now, as if they couldn't afford to leave it on. Neighbors began to whisper, and I didn't have to ask to know the rest. Dad taking extra jobs, Mom teaching summer classes, Olivia refusing to help with groceries. One afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell from 2 doors down stopped by with a plant. Your folks are struggling, she said gently, placing it in my hands. But that's their business, not yours. You've done enough. I thanked her, touched by her grace. The plant, a small peace lily, sat by my window from that day on. From my porch, I could see their daily unraveling. Dad left before sunrise, returned long after dark. Mom walked slower now, her posture wilted. Olivia's boyfriend appeared 1 week, gone the next. Arguments spilled into the driveway, sometimes loud enough to reach my open windows. The first time I heard Dad shout her name in anger, I froze, realizing how strange it felt to be free of that sound directed at me. Through it all, I kept building my own rhythm. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching the sky soften to pale gold. Afternoons filled with work calls with clients, the quiet hum of a home that answered only to me. Evenings were for small victories, painting a wall, hanging a curtain, planting lavender along the walkway. I didn't mean for it to become a statement, but soon the contrast between our houses was undeniable. Mine, once neglected, grew bright and orderly. Theirs dimmed each month, paint-peeling gutters sagging the front garden bare. Sometimes I'd catch my mother watching from their window, her silhouette still as a photograph. A few months passed. One crisp autumn morning, she waved when I stepped outside. It was hesitant, almost shy. I waved back. It felt like an unspoken truce. Small gestures followed her, leaving a bag of apples on my porch, me returning the basket with fresh muffins. Nothing said, but something understood. Then, one evening, as I was locking up for the night, she appeared at my door, holding a plate of cookies. The scent of chocolate and butter drifted between us. "I was baking," she said. "Thought you might want some." "Thank you," I said, taking the plate. She didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite her. But her eyes wandered over my painted trim, the soft lamplight spilling behind me. "We miss you," she said finally. "The house feels empty." I nodded. "I'm still here, Mom, just across the street." "It's not the same," she murmured. "Can't we go back to how things were?" "No," I said gently. "But maybe we can start fresh if we're honest this time." She looked down, then back up with tears she didn't wipe away. "I'll think about that." When she turned to leave, I noticed her steps were slower, but lighter somehow, as if she'd set down part of a weight. I closed the door, set the cookies on the counter, and stood there for a long while, the faint sweetness filling the air. Outside, the porch light from across the street flickered on, then off again. I watched it through the window until the night swallowed it. Somewhere in that darkness, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't dared hope for: peace, fragile but real. I knew reconciliation wouldn't come easily, maybe not at all, but it no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had found my own ground to stand on. And from that small, steady place, even the ghosts across the street didn't scare me anymore. The mornings felt different now. When sunlight reached across my porch, it no longer carried the weight of someone else's expectations. It spilled through my windows, quietly touching the bookshelves I'd built, the framed photos of friends, the coffee mug waiting on the counter. Even the hum of the refrigerator had become a kind of music. The house breathed with me, steady, alive, content. Across the street, the seasons had begun to change. Autumn leaves had long fallen, and winter was finally giving way to spring. The grass was thin, the flower beds bare, but the air was warming again. From my porch, I could see my parents' curtains open more often. Sometimes, Mom stood by the window in the mornings, her hands wrapped around a mug, looking toward my house. She didn't wave, not always, but she didn't turn away either. We had found a rhythm of small gestures, bags of fruit left on my step, a text about Grandma's health, a cautious "good morning" when we happened to get the mail at the same time. There were no apologies wrapped in speeches, no sudden declarations of change. Just a quiet awareness that something had shifted and that maybe was enough. It was late March when she asked to meet again. Not at my house, not at theirs, but at the little cafe halfway between. She arrived early, already seated by the window. The lines in her face seemed softer, somehow less about stress and more about reflection. She smiled when I approached, the kind of smile that carries humility behind it. "I've been thinking," she began once the waitress left our coffee, "about how we treated you, about how much we took for granted." Her eyes glistened, but she kept her voice steady. "I can't undo the past. I can only say I see it now. And I'm sorry." The apology wasn't grand or practiced. It was small, real, and human. I nodded, letting it land. "Thank you," I said quietly. That's all I needed. We talked for nearly 2 hours, not about guilt or blame, but about understanding. She admitted the fear that had guided her: fear of my father's temper, fear of family discord, fear of choosing between her daughters. I shared how exhausting it had been to play the role of peacekeeper, how invisible it felt to always be the responsible one. Somewhere between our words and silences, the walls began to lower. By the time we left the cafe, the afternoon sun had turned everything gold. She reached out, touched my hand briefly, and said I'd like to start again if you'll let me. I told her I already had. Dad's change came slower, but in his way, it came. He never apologized outright. His gestures did it for him. When his lawnmower broke that summer, I loaned him mine. He returned it clean, oiled, and working better than before. A week later, he stopped by to ask about the plants along my walkway. "Those hydrangeas are a smart choice," he said, eyes scanning the yard. "Good color balance." Coming from him, it was as close to admiration as I'd ever known. When I laughed, he gave a small nod, half proud, half relieved. That was our version of peace, a conversation about flowers standing where shouting used to live. Olivia took longer. For months, she kept her distance, alternating between silence and half-hearted friendliness. Her business had faded, her boyfriend was gone. The chaos she'd once hidden behind excuses was now laid bare. When she texted me asking for help budgeting, I didn't hesitate to meet her at a coffee shop. She came late, looking smaller, somehow tired, but trying. "I've made a mess," she admitted. "I don't know where to start." I showed her how to track expenses, how to separate needs from wants, how to save a little each week. She listened this time, really listened. When we finished, she looked at me and said, "I used to think you had it easy, that everything just worked for you. I never saw what it cost you to hold everything together." Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I just nodded. "We all learn, eventually," I said. It wasn't forgiveness in a single moment. It was understanding in pieces, one fragile step at a time. The following month, we began family therapy at my suggestion. Dr. Brennan, a quiet man with silver hair and kind eyes, helped us navigate what years of avoidance had left behind. The first session was awkward. Dad crossed his arms. Mom cried quietly, and Olivia picked at the edge of her sleeve. I sat still, letting the air settle around us. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," I said when it was my turn. "I'm here because I want a family that knows how to speak without hurting." It took weeks, but small truths started to surface. My father admitted his expectations had been uneven. Mom acknowledged how often she'd chosen quiet over fairness. Olivia confessed she'd resented me for being the one they relied on, not realizing I never wanted that role. Each word made room for a little more honesty, and in that space, something fragile but genuine began to grow. Outside the sessions, my life kept unfolding in gentle ways. My promotion at Meridian came with more freedom 2 days a week, working from home mornings spent with coffee on the porch as the neighborhood stirred awake. The house had become a reflection of who I was. Steady colors, open light, things chosen with intention. Michael, the neighbor who had once come by for advice on retirement planning, became part of my days too. What began as shared errands and porch repairs turned into dinners, then quiet evenings spent reading side by side. There was nothing rushed about it. It felt like breathing simple, even. When he finally reached for my hand during one of those evenings, it didn't feel like a beginning so much as an unfolding. By late summer, the rhythm of our street had changed. The grass on both lawns grew green again. Mom's hydrangeas bloomed a mirror of mine across the way. Sometimes we waved, sometimes we talked a little, sometimes we just existed side by side in peace. On the anniversary of the move, I invited my family for dinner. Nothing formal, just a Sunday meal under soft lights in my dining room. Grandma sat at the head of the table, her eyes gleaming with quiet pride. Dad complimented my cooking. Mom helped wash the dishes afterward. Olivia brought a store-bought pie, and stayed long enough to laugh at one of Grandma's jokes. When they left, the house fell into its usual silence, but it was a warm one this time. No tension, no ghosts, just stillness, the kind that feels like peace rather than absence. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. The same one I'd filled with tears and anger a year before. On the last page, I wrote, "What once felt like exile was actually freedom in disguise. What once felt like loss was space for something truer to grow." I closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside a framed photo of Grandma smiling on my porch. The window beside me was open, and a soft breeze moved through the curtains. Across the street, the porch light at my parents' house flickered on. This time, it stayed lit. I raised my cup of tea toward that gentle glow, a quiet toast to everything we had survived, and to the peace we were finally learning to keep. Sometimes I think about how life has a way of teaching through distance, about how leaving doesn't always mean abandonment, it can mean preservation. Standing up for yourself doesn't end love, it redefines it. Peace, I've learned, isn't given. It's built slowly with patience, truth, and a little sunlight. If this story found its way to you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose peace over approval, share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with me. May you find the quiet strength to build your own light wherever you stand.